Okay, everybody. Welcome back to Conspirinormal. We're still around doing shows for the time being, and I am very happy. Of course, I'm always happy to have this guest on because he's like one of the best guests that we've had, and that's Mr. Timothy Renner. And recently, he has released the book "I Have Never Minded the Loneliness: Hermits and Their Stories." And I was telling you, Tim, before we got started, that this is one that I think people can go back and, if they hear the other shows with you, I'm always asking you about the Hermit book every time we end the show, and now it is out. So, like, very happy that it's out. And something about this book, man, you probably heard this from some other people. Like, it really grabbed me, like the subject of hermits. I remember you talking about William of the Fiery Flowers on Strange Familiars.
Yeah.
And it's just something that really grabbed me. And from ever since you talked about that, that's when you're like, I'm writing a book about it. That's why I've always been excited to have this book come out. And it's a very, like, well done, very beautiful book, lots of photographs. There's your own illustrations, like every chapter has a heading with your illustrations, your illustrations of the hermits, and you can tell, the reader can tell that there's a lot of love that went into this. And
thank you.
I think the first question that I really have is, how did this whole project start for you? What got you interested in writing a book about hermits?
Well, it started with William Woodruff, William of the Fiery Flowers. That first episode I did on Strange Familiars, my wife bought me a photo postcard of him. So at the time I was doing the historical Bigfoot books. And of course they don't call him Bigfoot, they call him wild men back then. And she bought this postcard and she just gave it to me. She said, "Here, this guy looks like a wild man. Maybe you'll like this." And he kind of did look like a wild man. I mean, he was, not a Bigfoot, but just pretty rough and ready looking. I thought, oh, that's cool. And then it just got buried in stuff on my desk. Like if I could turn the camera and show you, you'd see now there's like stacks of papers, things I need to do for the business, things I need to scan, like artwork, research I'm doing for the podcast or other books and stuff. It's not a neat desk. So he got buried, and about 3 months later, shuffled to the top of the pile again. And I had time that day, and I just typed in his name. Said, I think on the postcard it calls him Billy Woodruff. It's Billy Woodruff, Colebrook River, Connecticut. Typed it in, and these stories started coming up, and I was like, what the heck? Like, what an amazing story. So I thought, well, I'll do a show on Strange Familiars. I'll see how people react. We'd done some history shows before that. Usually either missing people from the past or, true crime type stuff, but from the past, or like circus history, because my wife's a circus historian.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, we'll see how this does. And people really reacted positively to it. So I started collecting other hermit postcards. I started researching other hermits, and every now and then we would just do a hermit show. And again, people, like I said, people really responded to it. And I thought, you know what? Maybe I should write a book. So these stories really, there's a similarity to a lot of the stories, but it seems like each one is their own character and each one has their own story. And I began to just kind of fall in love with these characters. And yeah. This book really is it's my love letter to these folks, Can
I ask you, going back to the picture postcard, because most of the pictures that are printed in the book are picture postcards.
Mm-hmm.
So why was that such a thing as regards hermits? Like, how did hermits become this curiosity for this picture postcard? And then there are some of the hermits that actually are involved with like sideshows. Mm-hmm. So like hermits were like, you wouldn't think of that as being a part of sideshows, but and they were kind of a sideshow themselves, right? Because people would pay to see them, and they would make some money off of come see the hermit in his little hovel. That was a big deal. Like, hermits were like an attraction of the time.
Oh yeah.
Is there an explanation to that fascination?
Well, this is pre-TV, pre-internet, pre-radio,
Right.
and each town had their little newspaper, and I'm sure they were looking for human interest stories all the time. They do the world news, they do the big local news, maybe state news, and I'm sure they were looking for human interest stories. And I'm pretty sure, at some point, some reporter's like, well, what about that guy who lives up on the mountain there? Maybe we should do a story about him. He lives alone up there. What's his story? And sometimes they went and they got the real story, and sometimes they just made it up.
Yeah.
And that was a big part of my job, trying to determine what part was which there. But so I think it was human interest, and I think it was the same with photographers. So photographers would you could go to a local photographer back then and get your photo taken. Of course, that's probably the main part of their business. But they would also sell photos of local curiosities. And once the photo postcard comes in about right around 1900, like maybe 1902, something like that, really takes off in popularity around 1905, 1907. So it was easy for them to shift from making, photographs to these photo postcards. And they would sell them there. I'm sure drugstores would sell them. They make a little money. So you had pictures of local stuff. People could, pop that in their albums and stuff,
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing that you don't think about. And you found a lot of these, I guess did you go to the local communities that where these how did you find these different like postcards?
So my wife and I have been collecting antique photography since not long after we met. So for, since the 90s, early 90s.
Yeah.
And we go to photography shows and we go to postcard shows and antique shops and just, I pick stuff up wherever, and I just started to amass a collection. I think, I don't know if it's due to my book, but I've seen the price card on Hermit postcards that I was getting them for dirt cheap when I first started collecting. Nobody cared. I'd ask these dealers, like, do you have any Hermits? And they'd be like, Hermits? And, one of them might dig out they usually had them filed with like itinerants or stuff like that, or curious people. Sometimes they have, just like stuff like that. And I was getting them dirt cheap when I started. And, postcards I was picking up for $5. Now I see going for like 35, $40. So I don't know if the book had something to do with it. Me talking on Strange Familiars had something to do with it, or just it's in the air. I don't know what to blame that on. But yeah, I was picking them up pretty cheap for a while, and now I have to think about whether I'm going to buy it or not when I see one.
Yeah. Can we talk a little bit about these hermits and how does one become a hermit? There seems to be like this there's this theme throughout of like lost love.
Yeah.
And that seems to be a very common thing. And there's also along with that there's some misogyny involved in some of this, some of the hermits and the way that they talk about women and these things. And but also I think in some ways there would be like maybe at the time, which would have been undiagnosed mental illness, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, I think
so. What are some of your thoughts on that, especially with the lost love as being such a common theme?
Yeah, I mean, I realized like as I got towards the end of the book how often I had to address that as a trope. Because
right.
So many of these newspaper articles would just say, "Oh yeah, this guy got his heart broken, and that's the story, and that's why he went off to live alone." And that is the case in a couple of them, but a lot of them it wasn't the case. It's just what, like, I guess the people struggle with the idea of why would someone want to just drop out of society, and I think we still struggle with that idea. And back then, again, before the internet and before you could actually like easily get to the person and talk to them via, email or whatever. I think they would just often go, well, he must have had his heart broken, So it becomes this trope that's applied to a huge percentage of them. It's, how often is it true? It's hard to say exactly. I'd say probably if they apply it to 75% of them, it's probably true for 25 to 40% of them. But, certainly not all of them. And in fact, some of them addressed that specifically, and they said, "No, I've never had any problem with women. I just wanted to live alone." So
Yeah, and
the
so there could be some like yellow journalism involved in that you're trying to make it
sure,
more
yeah,
flowery
absolutely,
than it actually is, and
yeah, yeah, there absolutely was, and I mean the misogynist you're talking, or I think you're referencing, is
well, there were a few of
Albion
them. There
Club.
seemed like there were like two or three of them. One that said like he was done with women, and that he realized the error of his ways and didn't want anything to do
Yeah,
with them. You know,
yeah,
and there were some. There was one I think that was a little more tongue in cheek. That was
yeah.
part of it.
That's
That was really
Albion
an
Club.
act. Yeah.
He called himself the world champion woman hater, but
Right. Right.
for all accounts, it seemed like, I mean, it might have even been a little game he was running, because he said he would get letters from women all
Oh,
the time
sure.
saying like,
Yeah.
"I'll teach you,
Yeah. Yeah.
I'll be the woman that
Right.
you'll like." And then he went to New York at one point to go on a radio show. He's a musician. He played banjo and guitar and sang songs and stuff. And all the women that met him in New York had just nothing but glowing things to say about him. They just like loved him to death. So I think it was a little like that was his sort of
Right.
hook,
Right. Yeah. And
I
probably
think,
his gimmick too.
yeah,
Yeah.
I think it was working
Right.
for him though. He
It
had
was
plenty
working
of
for him.
women visitors. He had a stuffed dummy. So he had turned a boat into his hermit house. He called it the Ark of Maine. And he had a stuffed dummy that he called Brother Bill that he sat outside it. And he always said it's because women prefer dummies. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Right. Right. Yeah.
he would
Yeah.
save him. And then he had a stuffed
There's
snake over the door because the women were afraid of snakes. So he had this big stuffed snake he made over the door. Real character. But, you know, I think people see that world champion woman hater and they're like, wow, this guy's a real jerk. But it seems like actually quite a likable fellow in the end.
Yeah, and there's also seems to be like with the dummy, that reminded me of one that the guy that had the curated curiosities chapter.
Yeah.
That
Sir Isaac Newton Gay.
right, and you brought up the whole idea that this is like kind of a precursor to outsider art, and of course, that reminds me of like Howard Finster in Somerville, Georgia, if you're familiar with him. Kind of the same. You could probably he was an artist, and
Hmm.
you could probably make the case that he was a hermit.
Hmm.
Even though he was a renowned artist, but so there's that element too of like the the curiosity and the making a little museum for everybody, and this
Yeah.
the eccentricity.
Well, I mean, the way they describe Sir Isaac Newton Gay, the way they describe his place, and he was one of the multitude of hermits from New England. That's a big question. Why so many from New England? I think probably
New
75
Hampshire
percent.
seemed to have a lot of them.
New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut.
Right.
Yeah, it's just a lot of hermits up that way. But the way to describe it is like, oh, there's broken bottles and there's, doll heads and all this stuff. But they said he was always carefully arranged. It was always like kind of, and that's what made me think, and they're just like, oh, this guy lives in a garbage dump. But they're like, but it's carefully arranged and it's really displayed and set out in a certain way. I was like, well, he's just an outsider artist before his time. That's all he's doing. He's making his own world in a sense, his own museum. And he's seeing value in the stuff that people are discarding. To me, that just feels like an outsider artist, not a trash collector.
Yeah, absolutely. And is there a role though that you see that maybe that some of these guys could have been mentally ill? Because definitely like the leather man, that kind of makes me think
Well,
that of some mental illness there.
so I think there's definitely PTSD involved in some. I think,
Yeah, right.
Civil War happens and they tap out. I'm done. This is me diagnosing from, over a century later, so I don't really know,
Sure,
but I'm assuming there's some of that. It seems like definitely some were affected by the war. There's certainly some mental illness there. With the Leatherman, though, I mean, here's without a doubt, the most popular hermit in this book. And for those who don't know, is he was an itinerant hermit. So he moved around and he walked a circuitous route through New York and Connecticut every 34 days. He'd make this loop, and he was so consistent that they said farmers would, time their planting by when he arrived, so he's very, very consistent. He stayed in a series of caves and so forth. And he wore I think it was a 60-pound leather suit, summer and winter. So cold in the winter, hot in the summer. He wore this year round. It was a patchwork leather suit he made himself, cut from the tops of old leather boots and stuff. He made his own leather hat. He made his own leather boots with wooden soles, so completely inflexible wooden soles that he had to walk, I think, at least 10 miles a day in to make this loop on time. So he's walking 10 miles a day in these, chunky wooden boots with unbending wooden soles. He's basically stomping for 10 miles a day. He did not speak much English, or else he did not want to speak to people. He spoke a little bit English. He had a French accent. So the thing with him, though, is we really don't know. He's a true mystery, which is really rare. And even these men and women, from the 1800s, I was able to find information on every one of them, more or less. But the Leatherman is a true, true mystery. He starts popping up in the area in, I think it's 1858. Yeah.
That sounds right.
Yeah, 1858. And around 1883, he starts making this loop. So again, 10 miles a day, he goes in this loop. But in the 1880s, a man named W.A. Salson writes an article, and it's called Mystery Solved. And in this article, this is published in a few different newspapers in New England, he purports to tell the true story of the Leatherman. And he says, his name was Jules Bourgelat. He came from France. He was engaged to the daughter of a leather merchant. The guy put him in charge of his finances. He made these bad investments. Then the leather market crashes. He loses all the guy's money. The guy says, well, you're not marrying my daughter. He gets very upset, basically goes insane, ends up in America. How he got there, that's right. Not addressed in the article. He just...
No explanation. Yeah.
Ends up in America and, puts on this leather suit as penance of some sort for his lost love and all that. This is completely made up. This author completely made this complete fiction. He just made up the story. This is printed as the true story of the Leatherman up until the 1980s when they would write articles about him. They would, his name was Jules Bourgelat and blah, 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 blah. Even his old tombstone used to say Jules Bourgelat on it. And then finally somebody's, dug up information. No, this is completely made up. At some point, this guy admitted to it. And they dig up his grave. Sometime within the last 10 years, they dug his grave up. They were going to try to get some DNA and figure out who he was. And he had completely returned to the earth. There's nothing in his grave but a couple coffin nails. I guess he was in a wooden coffin, completely rotted out. So they could do nothing. We know nothing about him. They buried the 3 nails in a new grave for him, however many coffin nails there were. And the new grave says the Leatherman, because we do not know his real name. Mm-hmm. So that was corrected. That's a good thing. But what we do know about him is when he was dead, he had on a scapular, and he had a Catholic French prayer book in his pocket. We know he spoke French, and he would refuse meat on Fridays. So when people would try to give him meat on Fridays, he would refuse it. So we know for sure he was Catholic. Beyond that, we really don't know anything. If we had a name, we could look for him in the records. We could see if we don't know if he came from France or did he walk down from Canada. We only know he spoke French, He could have walked down from Canada.
Right. That would make more sense.
Yeah. We have no clue about the guy. We know he died of cancer. You can see in some of the photos, there's I want to say about 10 known photos of him, something like that. And in some of the photos, you can see his lips really swollen. He develops cancer in his lip. And towards the end, it's really sad. He's laying a piece of leather over his lip to drink hot coffee and soup and stuff. It was so sensitive. And some of the pictures, you can see the swollen lip. It's pretty brutal. So he dies of cancer in one of the caves in, I think, Sing Sing, New York. They find him. And there's just nothing that's really known about him other than that he was Catholic. He spoke French. He did not like to talk to people. He could talk to people, but he either did not like to talk to people or he did not want to talk to people. And I think this idea that he was like maybe simple-minded or something, we don't know. And we don't know, was he mentally ill? He literally might have been doing penance for something. This circular walk with this, it might have been his own form of penance that he put on himself.
Interesting.
Yeah.
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 So it's it's a real mystery. We have no idea who this man was or
absolute mystery, and we will never know. We will never know.
Yeah.
His suit was taken to a dime museum in New York City, and we don't know where that is. I'm not sure if it's one of the museums that burnt in New York or not. But in any case, we have no clue where the suit was. Some of the historical societies in Connecticut, I think, have some of his leather mittens and some of his pipes and maybe one of his boots or something like that. So there's some artifacts of his outfit do exist, but the main suit is gone. It's just missing. If it's somewhere, we don't know where it is. So yeah, he is a really unique character. He was kind to children. He didn't speak much to them, but there's stories with children like eating their lunch with them, and he would sit there with them. He was very kind to them. He did not beg. He would go to if the house had given him food, he would go to that house again. And those people, often gave him more food, but he wouldn't just beg on the streets. He didn't really ask anybody for anything. So he really is a true mystery. And that is a rarity. Even you'd think these hermits and stuff from the 1800s would be hard to find. And they are. They're not easy to find, but you can find them if you have a name, census records, almshouse records, even ship records. We found, some of them, what ships they came over on and so forth, if they're immigrants. So you can find people, even from that long ago, but the Leatherman there's just nothing on him. We'll never know who he was.
Yeah. Is there, you mentioned the penance aspect and doing penance. I mean, is there a religious aspect, do you think, for some of these men to go out into the wilderness?
A spiritual aspect, I think. And I have one hermit priest in here. And otherwise, I think that's another book. Like religious hermits are probably another book. And I don't know if I'm the guy to write that or not. Maybe I am. But that's in the future. I need to write something other than hermits for a little while. But there is a spiritual aspect to some of them who really seem to find themselves and find a mysticism in nature,
Yeah, I mean, I think, because you have an introduction from a gentleman that was kind of, I guess that that was living that kind of life for a little bit.
Yeah. This is my best friend, Prevlin.
Yeah.
Right before 9/11, he taps out and he says, "I'm going to go live by myself." And I think it was originally supposed to be only 9 months, and it extended a little bit beyond that, if I recall correctly. But he moves to this cabin, and his cabin looks very similar to the cabins that the guys have in the house. He's in not far western Massachusetts, but he's out in the western half of Massachusetts, let's say, in the mountains. No phone, no internet. I had to write letters to contact him. He developed his own calendar based on the moon, and he tells me, schedule your visits according to my calendar. I never really understood his calendar, to be honest. I never got it. So I got to say, oh, I'll be there between these days, I think, and I ended up getting there at 2 a.m. or something and knocking on his door. He'd be like, oh, hey, it's you, So,
yeah.
But, he really was living alone, and it was so isolated. He had enough food for himself, like rice and beans and stuff. But when you visited, you had to bring food. You had to bring your own food.
Mm-hmm.
So we'd have to cart in rice and beans or fish for our meals if we wanted, that and so forth. So he really did live that life, and he told me, and I believe he mentions this in his foreword. He's mentioned several times that those were some of the happiest times of his life, just being alone there in that cabin.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's like, oh, Tim, like when you start getting to a certain age, man, you start getting there. And especially with like everything that's going on in the world right now, it's kind of like it becomes really damn appealing to escape out into the woods.
I know it. I mean, there is the temptation
Well,
is great, and I think it was easier for those guys back then. The
yeah, right.
property laws have changed. Like Hermit of Irving Castle, the one who lives in a cave in outside of Athol, Massachusetts, there in Irving. He's comes from Scotland. He was actually an ornamental hermit, which that's actually like a professional hermit. We can get into that if you want. But he finds this cave and he just goes in the cave and he's like, I don't know if the property owner is going to kick me out or not. Eventually, the property owner finds him. You want to live in the cave? Live in the cave. It's like we're so litigious now that people. I think that's why people are so terrified of having somebody come on their property. That's why I don't know if I hike a lot and I've noticed the proliferation of no trespassing signs, or in Pennsylvania they have the purple paint now. You can just spray paint stuff with purple paint. It acts as a no trespassing sign, and it's the proliferation of that over the past 5 years is insane. Like they're just every 10 feet,
Yeah,
will mark
yeah,
their property.
right. It's getting more and more crazy. Yeah,
Yeah, which is, maybe this is a result of, post-pandemic stuff or whatever, but I can't help but feel like the main thrust of it is how litigious we are in America. In Scotland, they have right to roam, which is the best thing ever. It's basically like you have the right to roam across the land. It's like close the gate behind you so the cows don't get out,
Yeah.
That's an amazing thing, but we're so litigious here in the States that I think people are so afraid, you're going to stub your toe on their property and sue them that,
Yeah.
I don't like it, but I see why they do it. I see why people have no trespassing sign.
Yeah, it's an effect of that, I'm sure.
Yeah. So,
Well,
so they could, back then, there was more land for them to go on. And I think, a lot of them were on like state land and stuff, and they didn't have, oh, get off the land, you can't use it. A lot of them just like, whatever, the guy's not hurting anything, let him live there. So I think they are a product of the time. I think it would be harder to do that now, at least without your own property. You would need to have at least enough to have your own property.
there was one guy that was actually employed as a hermit for like a village.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like he was the village hermit and they paid him to be the hermit.
So that's the
So
ornamental
this was a
hermit.
real phenomenon of the time. Where was this? I think it was England, right?
It was so ornamental hermits were a thing in England, Scotland, France, and maybe a couple other places in Europe, but they were really big in England, Scotland, and France.
Yeah.
And if you were royalty, it became very trendy, starting about the 1600s on up to the 1800s. It became very trendy to have a hermit living on your property. So you could actually find these in newspapers back then. You can find these basically classified ads saying like hiring a hermit. Here are the conditions. You will be contracted for a year or 2 years or whatever it is. You're not allowed to cut your hair. Some of them you weren't allowed to cut your fingernails or toenails, which is to me, that'd be gross. That'd be the worst part. But some of them wanted
gnarly. Yeah.
Yeah. Some of them wanted religious hermits. They wanted, people had to be very pious and they had to, act certain ways and be, pray a certain amount and only read religious literature and so forth. And in exchange for this, they would provide them with food and a place to stay. So, you get a cave on their property if they have a cave, or there's even a book that was written basically for these wealthy royalty to give them ideas of structures to build for their hermits to live in. So it was very much a status symbol if you had your own hermit. So yeah, John Smith, the Hermit of Irving Castle, he was employed as an ornamental hermit in Scotland for years before he came to America. And that's why I think it's so, it's easy to laugh off the fact that he called this cave he lived in. He called it Irving Castle. It's easy to laugh at that, but when you think of it as like, no, he was subject to these lords and ladies. He comes to America, and now he's in control. He's in
Yeah.
control of himself, and that's his castle.
Yeah. Yeah.
He doesn't need to be in anybody else's castle. He has this
Yeah.
castle, and I think
Complete individual sovereignty. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, I
Right.
think it's really beautiful that he names it Irving Castle. It's
Yeah.
it's not a joke.
There,
I don't think.
there's something to this, and I think that um, that might hit on that concept of that individualistic sovereignty like that. I mean, I was fascinated a few months ago by this guy named Popcorn Sutton who lived in East Tennessee, Western North Carolina. He was a moonshiner, and you could probably say he was a hermit because I think he did live. I think he did live alone.
Hmm.
He may have, had a wife, but he spent a lot of time. This guy spends a lot of time out there moonshining. And like when you see like this guy living that life, it's kind of just like that's like true liberty. That's like true freedom.
Yeah,
Is like you're free from a job, anything. Now, granted, he's doing illegal shit in the woods, but
right.
it's like that's true freedom. It's like you're making your own way completely, and it's not necessarily an easy thing, right? You're gonna have like a lot of hardships, but that's what it comes with. And if you're comfortable, then you're kind of you can kind of see the contrast of being comfortably domesticated and the hard,
Hmm.
rugged life that is might be actually more rewarding. I don't know. It's an interesting concept.
It really is, and I think it appeals to a certain part in all of us. I don't know. I don't know if I have it until I would try to do it. I don't know if I have that. I think I could. I think I would
Yeah,
enjoy it, but I don't know. You know,
right.
I'm married with kids and I'm quite happy and have no plans to
Sure.
run off and do that. But the part of me is like, yeah, I think a pandemic too had a lot of people like, well,
Yeah,
I was alone for a long time. It's not so bad.
right, right. Well, I mean, you got the hair and the beard. I mean, you're getting there, Tim. So we'll see what happens. But I think one thing we should mention though is that you do because we say men, but there are actually some women hermits in the book as
Hmm.
well. I'd
Yeah.
like to talk about them too, and what would
Yeah.
maybe motivate because it is primarily men, and it seems to be that hermits are primarily men. But what would motivate women to kind of shut themselves off from society too?
So the two in the book are Alice Grace, and she's from England, and she came from a poor family, and I think both of her parents died, and most of her thing was like she didn't want to go to the workhouse. She I guess heard not nice stories about it. She wanted her independence. She
Right.
lived I think, in a stables for a while, and then couldn't even afford the rent for that, and she ends up living in a bacon box. And people are like, "What's a bacon box?" It's just a crate. It's a crate that bacon must have come in, I suppose.
Mm.
It's a big crate. There's photos of her in the book. You can see her sitting in it. She said that was her most valued possession because it would keep the weather off of her. So she makes her home in this bacon box, and she lives outside, and she does it for years. And every now and then they would catch her, like, what they call it, sleeping out. I think they called it, basically being homeless. And they bring her in and they'd fine her or something. She'd go right back to it because she didn't want to live in these workhouses. So I think for her, it was just keeping her independence. That was the motivation. Like she was very poor, but she wanted her independence. Eventually she's telling fortunes for people. And then towards the end of her days, she does end up going to a workhouse. And they said she was actually did quite well there. So I guess it wasn't as bad as she thought, but I think that was her main motivation, just to keep her independence. Jenny Yohanika, the other one, has this really, really tragic life. I mean, she's dirt poor in Holland. She marries there, has a daughter. Her husband dies. I think she and her husband just worked the fields, like as workers. They didn't own property. They worked for someone else. They would just go out and work the fields together day and night. And her husband ends up dying. She decides to try her luck in America. She comes over. She meets another man. Uh, they get married, and then he dies. And then that was in Chicago, I believe. She ends up in Indiana and in this little town, and she's getting along okay there. She and her daughter, and then her daughter dies. And I
Yeah.
think she's just like, I'm out. I think at that point,
Right.
because it was after her daughter died that she just went off into this place called Happy Hollow.
Yeah.
And at
That was
first
it.
lived in,
Yep.
I think she was living in like collier's huts or something at first. It's like really rough huts. And eventually, some of the women at one of the local churches end up building her a structure to live in a little house. And she becomes the what they called the Hermit Queen of Happy Hollow there in Indiana.
And I think that there's also a um you could also draw kind of a parallel to the granny lady too, like granny magic and these type of
Mm.
things. I don't know if you've seen the movie Cold Mountain, but there's a character in that has well in the book too. I mean, he's a
I've read the book and I've seen the movie, but it's been
yeah,
years for both.
yeah. So I mean, she kind of like nurses him back to health, and she's an old woman that just living out in the swamp
Mm.
by herself, and she uses like kind of the folk magic remedies that kind of nurse him back to health
Right, right,
and
right.
send him on his way because he was a deserted Confederate soldier. But the yeah, so I think that there's with the women, I think, and probably and also though too, yeah, you do make a point that there's one in the book that you believe practice powwow.
At least one, yeah, yeah. The
Yeah,
Gettysburg Hermit. There the signs are there. Let's put it that way. That
yeah.
he was doing some sort of powwow or folk magic. Yeah.
So is that just as a just to ask you this real quick? The in hoc signos vinces, the in the sign you will conquer. The whole
Hmm.
Constantine at the Milvian Bridge. Is that something that's used in powwow as like a charm or an amulet?
It's it's close enough to the things you find in powwow that to me it's like I don't think it's specifically in the Long Lost Friend. I don't have every powwow book, so
Yeah,
it may. I lean heavily on the Long Lost Friend. I don't believe it's in there, but it's so close to things you find around powwow that makes me think like, yeah, it just feels like it. Especially they said he had it written on all these different scraps of paper all around his place and on his person, stuff when they found him hanged. So it just feels powwowish to me. And the fact that he
yeah,
was in town earlier, so he had a problem with his neighbors. He said they were harassing him, and killing his. I think they killed his cat and or his dog. I forget which, and were otherwise harassing him. Like they said, he was like they were banging on the side of his cabin and his windows at night, which so maybe that or maybe something else we could get
You
into.
see, I thought that too, Tim. Whenever I read that, I was like, I wonder what's going on. What's going on here?
Yeah, yeah,
Is the wild man coming to see the hermit? Have we got a
right.
little
Well, I mean,
magical working going on here?
so he goes to town and he tells the sheriff if my neighbors don't stop bothering me, I'm going to cast a spell on them.
Yeah,
He literally says that. So we have that, and we have the in hoc signo vinces thing. It just feels like powwow to me. It really does. Like it just has the aroma of powwow or of some sort of folk magic. I say powwow just because he was German. It could be something else, but I don't know for sure. But it really feels like that to me. So yeah, that's the Gettysburg Hermit. He ended up hanging himself tragically, and for years his cabin stood for a few years after he was died, and like they said, various itinerant people came and stayed in it, but they would never stay long because they said they would hear weird sounds, and then his ghost was supposed to kind of walk through the woods on Wolf Hill there. So it was kind of haunted. So it makes you think like, was it haunted before? And was that the stuff he was hearing? I
yeah,
don't know.
that's super super interesting.
But I was able to find his at least the footprint of his cabin, which was pretty cool. Just knowing he was on Wolf Hill and knowing Gettysburg, and I was like, well, there should be something there. I should be able to find something on this guy. So I went over, and Wolf Hill is, they call it the Lost Avenue. It's like they said it's the most remote part of the Gettysburg battlefield, the hardest to get to. I would agree with that. To get to it, you kind of have, you're not even sure if you're trespassing when you park. And I honestly, I'm not sure to this day. Am I trespassing when I park there? I've not had any problems, but you kind of park at the end of this road, and there's this trail. It's very unclear. It's not well maintained. You walk this trail down to a creek, and you take a hard left, and you're not sure really you're in the right place until you get up on this hill, and then it looks like the rest of the battlefield. There's monuments and the signs and stuff that tell you about different parts of the battle that happened there and so forth. And then you're like, okay, I'm in the right place. So we went there looking for his place in February, my friend John and I, and we're looking all day. It was a nice warm day in February when we were there. And we spent most of the day there just looking all around, trying like through the woods, like maybe, this is a good place. Maybe it could be here. And you can actually hear this on the Strange Familiars episode. It's literally as we're leaving. I said out loud, okay, Hermit, if you're going to show us something, now's the time because we're getting ready to go. And not even 20 seconds later, I looked over to the left, off in a field, like off the main drag there. I see this indentation on the ground. It looked like a very even, like square or rectangle kind of indentation. I said to John, doesn't that look like a foundation or, the footprint of a cabin? He's like, it sure does. And we walked over there and we're looking, and John's like, yeah, something was here. This is a building was here. And in one of the articles, it mentioned a hand dug well that he had right next to his cabin. I said, if only we could find his well. And I swear to you, I looked over to my left right after saying that, and I see this perfect stone-lined hand-dug well. There's a photo of it in the book. I couldn't believe it. I was like, there's a well. There's still water in it after, over 100 years. And I was like, I couldn't believe it. I was like, I can't believe it was such an amazing thing. We went there to find it, and we found it. I was so happy. And my buddy Chad, I told him about it, and he's like, well, let's go back next week. So we went back the following week, and he's like, are you sure it's his cabin? I said, Chad, I'm sure. He's like, well, it burnt down. There should be carbon there if it burnt down, because carbon doesn't really go away. And I was like, well, I'm sure it's his cabin, Chad. And Chad's like, well, I'm going to dig down and look for carbon. So we go to the foundation. He digs down right away. He finds carbon. He's like, yep, there was a fire here. This is the place. And then Chad says to me, did you find his cave? Because the article said he lived in a cave for a little bit before he built the cabin. I said, no, we looked all over, Chad, and we couldn't find it. And Chad says, well, let's go up here. And we went just beyond the place where John and I looked, maybe 50 yards beyond. And then suddenly we see this rock formation, which isn't odd in Gettysburg. You've been there. There's boulders popping out of the ground everywhere.
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm.
Walked around the back side of it, and it's not really a cave. It's more like a stone chamber. It's like a boulder sitting on top of other boulders. It is, it can answer to a cave, but it's not technically a cave.
Sure.
But I see this opening on the other side. I'm like, is that it? And I went in, and sure enough, it was still there. He had taken stones and walled up the cracks to block the wind. And on one side, there was like the remnants of a chimney we could see. So it was 100%. That's where he was staying. And I couldn't
Just
believe it.
Living in his hovel. Yeah. His little cave hovel. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, he lived there for a while, and then he built his cabin. So.
Wow. What's the relationship? There seems to be, and I think this is natural, of course. Like there's an ongoing relationship with animals.
Yeah.
So some of them have a cat. Like there's one guy that had a cat that he's very attached to that he is later buried next to him, and packs of dogs and raccoons, and even one guy that was living with the bears.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what's and of course I think some of them had like domesticated animals like goats or sheep and stuff for food. But what's the relationship like with animals?
I mean,
with
some of these guys had a real appreciation for nature, and the one Mason Walton, I believe his name was, he's the Gloucester Hermit in Massachusetts. They said he could come out of his cabin and just hold his hands up and call chickadees out, and they'd land on his hands. He just lived among them.
Right.
He lived among them. So I think they just had this appreciation for nature that you get, when you live among it, and those were their neighbors. They often had all different kinds of pets, mice and squirrels and all kinds of stuff. The raccoon one was funny because he called him Satan, the raccoon, and he actually in one of the articles it talks about a lion tamer from, I think it might have been from Barnum. It's from one of the bigger circuses. This lion tamer, the circus happens to be in town. He wants to go visit this hermit, and he goes there and he sees this raccoon chained to a tree. And he says, "What's that?" And, he's like, "Oh, that's my pet raccoon, Satan. He can't be tamed. He's real mean." And the lion tamer says, I've tamed lions. I can tame a raccoon." And I think the raccoon sends him running. The lion tamer is just like, "I want no part of this thing." So,
Yeah.
but yeah, they live close with nature, and I think that sort of becoming friends with animals ends up being part of that.
Unless you have a rabid raccoon, then you
Yeah.
gotta dispatch it forthwith.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, all raccoons are Satan to me. So,
Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the individual hermits, and let's start with the one, William of the Fiery Flowers. I mean, let's start with him. And I know that that's one that, like, he has a special place in your heart, and he's actually like I said, this book is so beautiful with all the illustrations, but the very frontispiece of the book is William of the Fiery Flowers.
Yeah, I mean, well, he's the first one, so he kind of, I had to make him chapter one. He kind of caught my imagination. He was, and his story, I think, is really a combination of truth and legend, and parsing one from the others is pretty hard in his case. Like, for instance, so he supposedly had his heart broken by this Agatha Hinsdale, was the name they gave to her in the paper, and they said she was the daughter of a lieutenant governor. Well, I looked up, every Connecticut lieutenant governor from the history of Connecticut, it's from the time they started having lieutenant governors. And I can't find a Hinsdale in there anyways. But so was that her married name from later on, or, was she made up? I don't know. But supposedly, William's in his 40s, she's in her 20s. He asks her to marry him. She turns him down. He takes a vow of silence and goes off to his cabin. He has this daguerreotype picture of her that he keeps with him at all times, photograph of her. And he begins planting around his cabin hollyhock flowers, which were said to be, that was her favorite flower. Now, he doesn't talk to people. We know this. Is it a vow of silence, or does he just not like talking to people? I don't know. He does grow hollyhocks around his cabin because several newspaper articles it's documented, like, he's handing out these flowers to people who pass by his cabin. His cabin was along a road that went between Colebrook River, Connecticut, and Winstead, Connecticut at the time. Wasn't a well-traveled road, but people would have used it, So when people pass his cabin, he's handing out these flowers, so he will not speak to them. They say he doesn't say a word, he just hands them these flowers. A photographer comes to, take pictures of him in the early 1900s. He tries to interview him. He will not speak to the photographer. He does, however, talk on a few occasions. He goes to Winstead one time and asks for apple pie. He wants apple pie. At one point, he's chased into his cabin. He had a telescope, and he would, look at the stars and so forth. And he was out stargazing one night and says there's a bear that chased him into his cabin. And he asked the stagecoach driver going by if he could get him some shells for his gun because of this bear. So he does talk to people on occasion. But, did he have a vow of silence that he occasionally broke? Or did he just have a practical vow of silence because he left alone and there weren't many people to talk to? I don't know. The thing that really stuck with me about him is, so he's the first hermit I'm into, and I get into him because of these wild man stories that I'm, these Bigfoot stories, these historical Bigfoot stories that I'm researching. Well, at the exact same time he's living there, Winstead, Connecticut, has this wild man outbreak. And something was the Winstead wild man is going on. It's some pretty intense encounters. Like there's one encounter that's got these people firing the whole stagecoach opens up firing on this wild man, this hairy creature, and doesn't hurt him at all. They're all just open up firing on him. Nothing. Doesn't seem to react.
Where the
Other
footprints,
cases,
footprints in, my friend.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Other cases of them, she like chasing hunters out of the woods, and it's pretty intense, like series of encounters that are happening. But one of them, they say, that people are riding by on horses, and they said, "Oh, there's a wild man sighting." And what they describe is not a big hairy creature. They describe a guy coming out of the woods. They said I think he was wearing like overalls or something. I forget what they described, a flop hat or something. And he comes out of the woods and he's holding something in his hand. And they said they can't see what he's holding in his hand. Well, that's obviously a human, And considering where it was, between Colebrook River and Winstead, I think it was very likely that it was William Woodruff that they saw. So not only is this first hermit that I'm researching has this crossover with the wild man research that I'm doing, but he's also mistaken for a wild man at one point, for one of these Bigfoot type wild men at one point. And then they said he was holding something kind of in his jacket. And I did wonder, like they said, he never left without that daguerreotype. He always had that daguerreotype of Agatha with him. So I do wonder if that's what he was holding, in that account. But it just seemed like everything seemed to click, I'm really supposed to research this guy. There's crossover with my other research I'm doing. It's pretty neat thing. William Woodruff died. Go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead, Tim. Go ahead. Fine.
So William Woodruff dies in a fire, and there's definitely a more romantic version told him, and probably the real version. The more romantic version is that he just burns his cabin down and he sits there in the flames holding this daguerreotype photo and just, very stoically burns alive and dies in the fire.
Intense.
Probably the more realistic thing that happened is he's smoking in bed. His beard catches on fire from a spark.
Yeah, right.
Ends up catching his bedding on fire. His whole place catches on fire. He ends up walking. I think they said 2 miles to the nearest neighbor in either bare feet or stocking feet. And this is like February in, Connecticut. Horrible burns all over his body. And then he ends up going to, they bring a doctor in and he ends up going to some medical house or poorhouse or something. But anyway, he dies within a month or two of that. And I can only imagine it was pretty horrific couple months there because he was burned very badly from what the article said. So that's probably the sadder story there is probably the real story of his then. But they said he never moaned or complained once from the pain. So, he sort of kept that vow of silence if it really was a vow of silence.
Was there a tendency to romanticize these stories? And, also to we know that Agatha was a real person, so that's not just a.
Well, we don't know. Like I said, I looked up. I don't know if she was a real person or not. Yeah. Or if that's just part of the story they made up. I really don't know. It seems like, he had friends in town. He was a popular guy when he was young. He would go to dances and so forth. So it seems likely that he had a romantic interest, at some point. But, was that her name? Did it really go down like that? I do not know. As far as
it seems like there's a story that there is a story there, but it could be that it's just all these people that he told, and then they're telling other people, and then it gets. Possibility things get changed around, and then it becomes there is an urban legend
there is
aspect of this,
and there's a problem with memory too. Like taking William as an example, there's a woman who in the 1950s she was quite old in the 1950s, writing this sort of journal, like her memories of Colebrook River. So Colebrook River, the town, is now underwater. It's under a reservoir. It's one of these towns that they flooded out at some point just to make a reservoir. And William's house would not have been flooded because he was up on a hill just outside of town. So he's, his house, I believe, or the remnants of it, wherever it was, is not underwater. But, she's telling these stories and she talks about William Woodruff a few times in her recollections. And one of the things she says is at some point he's robbed. Some people break into his cabin and I think beat him up and steal whatever money he had, which was like $5 or something, and a watch. And she blames it on those photo postcards. She's like, "Oh, that's because that photographer from Winstead, that's who took the photo postcards. He made him popular, and people knew about him then." Well, that couldn't have been the case because he was attacked in the 1890s, and those photo postcards weren't published until like 1907 or something like that. Absolutely could not have been the case. So her memory is wrong. But that was her memory of it. So that's the way it works sometimes. I think people, your memory's not perfect. So
There's also a mode. Go ahead, Tim. Sorry.
You get a lot. I think with
Yeah.
these men and women. Go ahead.
Well, there's also a motif in the book of like hermits being attacked and their stuff being stolen and people harassing them, and
Hmm.
so it doesn't seem like it's always this like kind of quaint little story and that everybody loves the hermit.
Yeah, yeah. So
They get run off their land, and people like John Stink is a good example, I think. But like but there's several others where just like you usually some of them that you conclude the chapter about them with like he got stolen, he got killed, he got it seems to be a very common thing in their existence to get their stuff raided and
yeah.
stolen.
So the first most popular or most often heard trope is that this lost love and their heart was broken. They walked in the woods. The second is, oh, this guy's got money buried somewhere. He's
Right,
actually rich. And
right,
in the case of some of them, it was true. There were a couple of these hermits that were quite wealthy that just
yeah,
tapped out of society, but for the most part, they were not. And the George Washington Gilbert, the barefoot hermit, at some point he's just like, please stop telling people. He's talking to the newspaper. He's like, please stop telling people I have money. I don't have any money. Like people are showing up at my place or digging holes in the ground, trying to find where I've hidden this money. He's like, I don't have any money. Stop it.
yeah.
So it happened enough where it became a problem for these fellows. These rumors that, oh, this guy's got money, and people would attack him and so forth.
That was that reminded me of something happened here in the Nashville area. String Bean, the banjo player.
Yeah, yeah,
He really was keeping money in his house, and I guess because being a child of essentially a child growing up or coming up in the Great Depression,
hmm,
that's what you did.
oh yeah.
This is like in the '70s, and kept money in his house, and people found out about it. And they did kill him and rob him.
Oh,
So, but he was living by himself.
I didn't know
So
that. That's how it ended
yeah,
for him.
yeah.
I'm aware of String Bean. I think he played Clawhammer too.
That was in Hendersonville, Tennessee,
Mm.
because he played for the Grand Ole Opry. So, but but let's talk about John Stink, because
Oh,
this is an interesting one, because you've got some interesting cult. This is like a hermit in like really in a different culture, and why
yeah,
he rejected essentially by his own people.
yeah, and like let me say this like from the start. The information I have, so John Stink, his name was Hotomoe, and he gets renamed John Stink at some point. He was Osage Indian. And I have to say, the information I have is mostly from white sources. So I don't know how much of this like jives with Osage beliefs. I want to be respectful of that. But, I can only go by the newspaper stories that were printed. So with that in mind, the story goes that they called him the living ghost. And the story goes that he died and came back to life as many as 3 different times. And when he came back, he would return to his people. Like some of these stories, he was literally buried, sometimes in a pile of stones and, sometimes just left in the woods or whatever it was. And he would, exhume himself and return to his people. And they said, essentially, no, the dead are meant to stay dead. And they were, said he was not himself anymore. He was not Hotomoe. And they renamed him John Stink, So this is the story goes. And there's, I don't know, let's see how many different ways I have him dying. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Looks like 14 different ways that newspapers reported that he had died, you know. and come back to life, they all can't be true, you know. But he comes back to life and supposedly is rejected by his people and essentially becomes a hermit, you know, uh, not by choice. But something happens in the early 1900s, and the Osage land is has an oil strike, and they become, at that time, per capita, I think the wealthiest people in the world. So there's a lot of money in the Osage down there, and including John Stink, he got his share of the money as well, and he could have built a mansion if he wanted to. And at some point, they built a house for him, and he wouldn't. He just didn't. He said, "No, living inside makes me sick. I don't want to. I don't want to live inside." So he could live anywhere he wanted, and he chose to live outside. He wanted to live outside. So, you know, was he rejected, or did he just want to live outside? You know, I don't know. I don't know. But he was he was known locally for sure. He became the subject of photo postcards. Some of them looked like he was just sitting on the street and he didn't know he was being photographed, or standing on the street. Some of them, later on, he gets some property and he builds a barbed wire fence around it. And he's standing at the edge of the barbed wire fence in some of the photos, and they take photos of him, you know, at the edge of his property. So he befriends dogs. He has a whole pack of dogs, and you can see this in the newspaper. There's a rabies outbreak in Pawhuska, Oklahoma. This is the town he's around and in up until a point. And they said all dogs are required to have a muzzle except for John Stink's dogs. So right there in the newspaper, it says it. Like, every dog has to have a muzzle, but not John Stink's dogs, because his dogs were well trained and they were around him, and, you know, like that. So it wasn't a worry with John Stink's dogs. But then, you know, I'm looking through the newspapers, and I'm going, and, like, you know, a few weeks later, there's this incident where this town marshal shoots and kills every one of his dogs. And we're talking like 8 dogs or something. He shoots and kills them. And he says, "Oh, I thought they were attacking him," which I just find incredibly difficult to believe. I think he was known about town. He was known well enough that they put this exception to that law in the newspaper form. I think it was done maliciously. And John Stink makes a vow, and he says, "I will never return to this town again." And he doesn't, except for, I found one occasion where he did go back to town. I can't remember what it was for at this point, probably supplies or something. But beyond that, he never goes back to town, and he stays outside of town from that point on. And, you know, for a while, like I said, he lives in tents and around different places, moves around to different places, but eventually buys property, sets up this big barbed wire fence, and basically, you know, lives there. But he does get more dogs, but it's just this, you know, I found that, like, just terribly sad. This, you know, the guy just shoots all his dogs. He had to have known who John Stink was. Everybody knew who he was.
Let's talk about Theodore Lamb.
Ah, yes, he's the fellow that the gave me the title for the book. He when he came up, I had a Hermit search set on eBay. I probably shouldn't give that away because I don't know if I'm going to get more competition for myself for Hermit photos. But he came up in a Hermit search, and I looked at him and I thought, this is a crust punk guy from, like, you know, the last 10 years or something. He looks like he could be in Nausea or something, like crust punk band. He looks incredibly, you know, modern in that sense. I mean, or maybe timeless. He's got the toes cut out of his shoes to sort of make sandals. He's got dreadlocked hair, this big beard. He's wearing, you know, dark clothes with, like, holes and patches all over him. He just really looks like he'd fit in a crust punk band. And he's a fellow that just, you know, I think he lived with his parents for a while. He was a clock repairer for a while. And after a bit, he just is like, I'm done. And he taps out. And the newspaper actually printed a story that said, oh, he, you know, he was brokenhearted, and that led him to seclusion. And another newspaper tracked him down, and he actually said, "No, I've never been crossed in love. When I was a youngster, I used to like girls, but I learned the stupidity of it all. I'm not a woman hater. I just don't believe in marriage. I have a happy life, and I've never minded the loneliness." So he just walks away, and that he wasn't. They weren't too happy with him because of the way he looked. I mean, even now, people like that get second glances. At the time, he wasn't allowed in any of the shops in town. He'd have to stand in the doorway, and they'd bring him his groceries. If he wanted groceries or something like that. But he wasn't hated through the community. He was just you know known for what he was. Yeah, I don't think he was considered a nuisance. He just back then I think looks were more of a thing. For more of a problem for people.
The Hermit of Mosquito Pond, and I love this one. I love your drawing that you did for him. This one's got a little bit of a. This one's kind of mystical, I think, and
Yeah,
like see, the claim of psychic powers and
yeah. He was and he wrote poetry too, and I really really wanted to find his poetry, but none of it exists anymore. I contacted the historical society up there. It's outside of Manchester, New Hampshire, is where he was, and I thought like, man, it would be great to have his poetry. He's supposed to be quite a good poet, but none of it exists anymore. All of his poetry is gone. He was so he came from England. He was I believe he was a vegetarian, and he was an herbalist. And he traveled through Europe, first of all, just like searching for, different plants, new plants and stuff to use. Ends up in America doing the same thing. He travels through Pennsylvania and up through New England. And then tries to be a lawyer for a bit and doesn't work for him. And in his case, he really did fall in love with a woman who her name was Betsy Baker, and she broke his heart. And he goes off and says, "Well, I'll just be a hermit for the rest of my life, I guess." And the reason why we know he actually would sing. He made music and made his own songs up, and he had a song called "Cruel Betsy Baker," and he actually told someone, "This is about the woman who broke my heart," and he would like sing this song. So in his case, it was one of the cases that it actually was true. He seemed like he got a broken heart and he's tapped out. But interesting guy. You know, grew all kinds of vegetables. He had a big sheep flock, and he said he could find people in the woods uh, if they were lost. So this is a quote from me. He said, "All I have to do is wait until it's dark, and then my power comes to me. I can see the person
yeah.
for whom I am looking, and can go right to them. I can tell whether they are dead or alive too. How can I tell? By their blood. I can see it. You know that when you hold your hand up to the light, you can see the blood in your fingers. It looks kind of pink. When a person is dead, it stops circulating, and when the hand is held to the light, the blood shows black against the light. I've often brought drowned persons to life. That is, people have thought that I did. But while the heart had stopped beating so far as they could tell, I knew the persons were not dead because of the blood in their hands was pink to the light. If they were dead, it would have been coagulated. I worked over them, and in time they were resuscitated, much to the surprise of the people who had said they were dead." So he kind of claimed to have these powers to find people, in the woods there outside of Manchester. When I did my hermit road trip, I didn't go up that far because there's not much left of those woods he was in, and it's kind of like
Yeah.
a very populated place. I don't think I could find much of where he was.
Yeah, it's been developed and civilized.
Hmm.
The unfortunately. The I like the man who fell to earth as well.
Oh yeah.
Kind of I mean and in a way, he kind of reminds me of like the contactees,
Hmm. He turns up
later
in
on,
UFO
yeah.
books. In fact,
Does he?
as I was writing this book, Josh was like, "Hey, you should check out this hermit. So and so told me about him." And he sent me whatever story Josh had. I was like, "Yeah, that's not the right story on him." It's but yeah, he claimed to be from Mars. Um, Commodore was Commodore. I'll find it here. Uh, Commodore Downs. His name was Truman Downs, but they called him Commodore Downs.
Yeah.
And he said he came from Mars, and he lived around Chautauqua Lake in New York there. And basically kept to himself. He, lived by fishing for the most part. But whenever people would ask him where he came from, he said, "Oh, I came from Mars." Sometimes he would say Venus or Jupiter. And
Mhm.
it's a short chapter on him because there's just not a lot of information on him. But
Right.
they in the Almshouse and Asylum records, so he was taken there in August of 1880. He died in about a year later, July 1881. And in the Almshouse records, it has place of origin, and it says Jupiter there. So,
Right. Right.
assuming he didn't mean Jupiter, Florida, which I don't think he did, he
Yeah.
was sticking to those claims of coming from outer space until his last days. The funny quote from that was he said that said he had been ejected from the red planet and slid down a rainbow, landing upon the Earth, and he found it difficult to obtain nourishment. His otherworldly diet consisted of ethereal air and electric fluid, but he found whiskey to be an adequate earthly replacement for those things.
For these guys, it's like um, there does seem to be a parallel, and I think you bring this up about the in Hinduism, the itinerant
Mm.
and these type of things, and I feel like in another culture, these guys probably would have been more revered as holy men.
Quite
And
possibly. Yeah.
in fact, I mean, you use another part of the in the very beginning of the book. I mean, you use the tarot imagery of the hermit.
Hmm. Yeah.
So this is definitely a motif that goes, way, way back. And I mean, we can go back to was the guy that sat on the pillar,
Hmm.
the saint, and
Yeah.
but these seem to be the kind of like a modern day version of holy men.
Yeah, and I'm actually reading a book about yeah, another hermit right now. It was
Yeah.
in from France, who may or may not have been healing people. The people ascribe healings to him. You
Mm.
know, and this fellow was in the 20th century, so there does seem to be a sort of I don't know, like a something ascribed to these people, whether they have it or not. And a lot of these folks in the book, some of them would claim to have these powers. Uh, Albion Clow, the world's greatest woman hater, he claimed to be able to predict the future and was awful at it. His weather
Right.
predictions were never true. He predicted his own death and lived, I think, like 3 years beyond that. But people would sort of listen, like the other guy, the barefoot hermit, George Washington Gilbert. They would watch his feet. The people in the town and there in Connecticut where he lived would watch his feet because they said if he put his shoes on before November, it was going to be a hard winter. But if he waited to November to put his shoes on, then it was going to be a mild winter. A lot of these guys, they said, were great weather predictors. I think John Stink, they said, was a weather predictor. So there is some sort of notion of power or extra abilities or whatever you would call it ascribed to people, and you wonder, is that just because people, is the woman living on the edge of the village alone is often a witch, whether she really was or not. People would say she was a witch. Jenny Yahanika, she was not a witch, but living there in Happy Hollow, some people said she was a witch, just because she's a woman living alone out there by herself. So these people, living alone and separating themselves, they often, people ascribe these powers to them. I think whether they had them or not. I think some of
Right.
them may have been able to tap into stuff. I think others were happy to let people think they had powers and just capitalize on that in any way they could.
Right. Uh, there's also you do one last one before we stop. Nature Boy, who actually has some influence on popular culture.
Yeah, yeah. So there's a song written by Eden Abez,
Yeah.
and I think that's the way his that's pronounced.
Right. It is. Yep.
That was initially made popular by uh yeah Nat King Cole. Nat King Cole didn't write it. Eden Abez wrote it.
Yeah.
Um, that describes someone living like kind of close to nature and so forth. So this guy, you know, becomes known as Nature Boy. And again, was this song written about him? Eden Abez kind of lived in the same way. He might have been writing the song about himself, but he was in the same area. This is Palm Springs, California.
Yeah.
He was very much in the same area, and it's highly likely he knew, if not had met William Pester, the hermit that was called Nature Boy. So it could have been about him. It really could have been about him. Pester was born in Germany. He comes to America to escape military service. He's part of this Lebensreform movement, which is like a back to nature, back to earth movement.
Yeah. It was one of the. It was the. I think it's like the Wandervogel was a movement that even. I mean, it was around. I think in the 20s and 30s in Germany, in the Weimar era. Yeah.
He comes to America. He ends up in New York, travels through the South, ends up in California, becomes this hermit in the desert out there, lives off of figs and whatever else he can find. If you look at photos of him and photo postcards of William Pester, when you can find them, are not cheap. Just for a postcard, there's like 80, sometimes up into $100+ for photo postcards of him because of this Nature Boy association, I think. But what people don't talk about is the fact that one of the other photos of him in the book is his picture from San Quentin. He was done up for what is noted in the prison records as a sex pervert. So he was messing around with underage boys and found himself in prison for, I think, 4 years for it.
Yeah. And it seems like, I mean, in the gallery, you have that one you talked about in Strange Familiars where this guy was accused of sexually molesting a young girl. Like this, there were some themes in there too of that. So,
These
guys were probably escaping these type of, escaping something,
Yeah, I mean, in some cases, certainly. Yeah. I'm pretty sure the guy on the cover, he changed his name, and I think it might have been for legal reasons. He's the snake catcher on the cover there. Well, anyway,
Right.
to finish up with William Pester, he ends up dying. He comes out of jail, ends up dying in Arizona. He goes to Arizona to become a hermit there, and ends up dying there. Yeah, Brusher Mills is the fellow on the cover. He's a snake hunter from England. Very interesting. But he just ends up kind of dropping out and sort of disappears into the woods. And I wonder if there wasn't legal problems, if only maybe like financial stuff, where he just kind of suddenly pops out of, public life and ends up being a hermit. But the cool thing about him, other than just being a snake catcher and all that, is for years and years and years, many people thought that he was the guy on the cover of Led Zeppelin 4. So the guy with the sticks on his back or whatever it is on the cover there. Yeah. It ends up that he is not. They found very recently, I think the past year or two, they found that out who exactly is on the cover of Led Zeppelin 4. It's not Brusher Mills, but for years they thought he was. Taking that further, if you open if you have the original album of Led Zeppelin 4 and you open the gatefold is a big image of the sort of the Hermit tarot card. Popular on Led Zeppelin shirts everywhere,
Right.
Sort of double Hermit connection there.
Is that from the Rider Waite deck, I think?
Roughly. Yeah, I think it's like some, that's what the image is based on anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
You've also got, just kind of as we're kind of winding down here, you've also got a whole section of this book that is nothing but photos. That is like a hermit miscellany, you call it. And why did you include this? And it also seems that you probably have enough for a part 2.
I definitely have enough for a part 2. It was over 300 pages, and I was just like, there was more stories I wanted to tell, and I was just like, this book I have to finish this at some point. And I'm usually like, whenever I'm in a creative project, I'm usually really, really good at being the guy who's like, nope, this is done. This is finished now. And I was really struggling with that with this book. I didn't know, like, when is it done? so eventually I just gave myself a deadline. Said, okay, it has to be done. You know, really, I was hoping. No, well, I was essentially done by November of 2024. I just, had to clean it up and do a couple more illustrations and edit it and all the stuff that goes into. But so I sort of made that deadline for myself, and I realized like, well, I'm not going to be able to tell these stories. And I collected all these images. Some of them were people I knew. Some of them I didn't know their stories. Some of them I knew enough only to, what I put in the caption of the photos. And some of them I could have written full articles on, but I was just like, you know what? I have to call this book done. And it's already over 300 pages. So I decided just to put a gallery section in and, tell the stories as best I could in the captions and present. That's sort of the 90+% of my Hermit photo collection is represented in this book now because of that section. So
Yeah. And we should say too that like you do not have this book available on Kindle, and you kind of explained to me why.
yeah,
Now I understand why.
yeah, Kindle doesn't play nice. Ebooks don't play nice with photos and illustrations for some reason. And in fact, Mike Clellan helped me do a couple of my other books, make them into ebooks, and basically took out all the illustrations, which is fine for those books. Not ideal. I would like it if my illustrations were in those books, but this one, the photos and the illustrations are so much a part of it. I feel like, and I poured my heart into every aspect of it. I'm super proud of the illustrations. I think they're my best illustrations.
Oh, yeah,
But
they're great. Yeah.
even if I had to remove my illustrations, the photos, like, I purposely did that so you could see a photo of almost every hermit in the book. You see a photo of. I think there's 4 in the book out of 30
Yeah.
some plus hermits that don't have photos.
Right.
Every other hermit I write about, you actually get to see. And to me, that felt so important, that you actually get to see what they look like. You get to see pictures of their houses sometimes. And I can't see just putting the text out without that. It just feels like I'm losing a big part of the book. So if someone can help me figure out a way to present this as an ebook with the images, I'm open to it. But for now, it remains a print only.
And you're going to do an audio book, but
Yeah.
as I'm reading this book, Tim, I just think this would make like a beautiful coffee table book for real. Like it just the pictures and the illustrations, like it would. I mean, it's a beautiful book as it is, but it would make a really beautiful book, really beautiful coffee table book.
I was looking at doing a hardcover version of it, and the price jumped so much as soon as I turned it into a hardcover that I was like, oh man, I guess
That's
it's doing
the joy of self-publishing, I guess.
yeah, I guess it's doing pretty well on Amazon. Well enough where if you type in hermits, this is the first thing that comes up, so that's a good thing. But would it do just this is my first book outside of the paranormal, right? Like that isn't like specifically a paranormal book. So
Right.
I didn't know like how's this going to do. I have no clue, so I didn't want to like make the cover cost like, $35 or whatever it would be if it was a hardcover, not knowing that, but I could certainly do other editions in the future. I could if the demand is there, I could do a version in color so you could actually get to see the photos in sepia, like on the cover and so
Oh,
forth.
nice. Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to part 2. Part 1, I think, is a masterpiece, and
Thank
it's your
you.
best work yet. Where can people find the book? And they can, I think, get it directly from you as well. If
You
people
can
want
get
a
it.
signed copy, which I have my signed copy.
You can get it directly from me. My contact information is always at strangefamiliars.com, and you'll find links there to my Etsy shop. That's where you can get, I'll sign it. You don't even have to ask. I'll sign it before I drop it in the mailer. But you can get it on Amazon. You can get it. You can order it into your local bookstore. Anywhere you get books, you can get it. So, look, Amazon's easy. I know they're a giant evil corporation, but I also know they're really easy and they're kind of inescapable. So I don't have any problem with people, and they're actually
Yeah.
pretty fair with their split on this, for me, for the independent authors and so forth. So I don't mind people getting on Amazon. I'd love it if you ordered into your local bookstore. People have sent me photos of it, in local bookshops already, which is incredible. Like somebody said they had multiple copies in like a local bookshop in, I think it was North Carolina or someplace. Wonderful. Yeah, I love that. So wherever you've got books, you should be able to pick one up.
Yeah. Well, very nice, Tim. I mean, this has been great. What's next for you? What's next for Strange Familiars? Is some new stuff coming along the pipe that you're going to be doing?
Yeah, Strange Familiars. We're working on the live show. It's going a lot slower than I thought because John and Tyler, my partners in that, really want a video element, and it will make for a more interesting show, live show. So I'm not fighting it, but it is taking a lot longer to get that done. My hope was to have that on the ground and touring by spring. That's probably not going to happen, but we're working on it. We will get it done as soon as possible. So that would be hopefully a touring live show as long as we can get venues booked. We'll be touring with that hopefully by late 2025. More of the same on the show. Right now we're doing a paranormal experiment that includes our patrons. I can't really talk too much about it, but if you're a patron, you can find out about that, and that should be fun. And book wise, I think hopefully I won't take 3 years to do my next couple books. While I was working on this one, I was doing research on some of those. I want to do a couple books on Pennsylvania folklore, and I've got some little illustrated things coming up, another little collection of illustrations and stuff. But on the horizon, it's 1 or 2 books on Pennsylvania folklore. I think should probably be next.
Very interesting. Well, thank you, Tim, as always. It's always great to have you on. And our episode 500 is coming up, so we'll probably have you on pretty soon again.
Alrighty.
So, yeah, guys, thank you, Tim, so much. Sergio wasn't able to be with us, but I'm sure he sends, his best. And also, he will be back next week. We're going to be talking to Gabriel Kennedy. We're going to be talking about Robert Anton Wilson. So, a book that he's written about him called Chapel Perilous. So, we'll be looking forward to that. And guys, we still have our Patreon. If you want to support us in any way, that's one of the best ways to do it. And so if you want to throw us a little bit, if you enjoy our content, there it is. All right, guys, we will talk to you next week on Conspirinormal.